Hi, everybody. Al Bernstein here with another one of my quick hits videos. And on this one, I want to talk about what might have been one of the best and most interesting and most fun weekends I've had in all of the 35 years that I have been a boxing broadcaster. And that's taking in some pretty big territory. It happened a couple of weeks ago when I went down to the Seminole Hard Rock Casino in Florida for not only a heavyweight match that featured Shannon Briggs taking on Mike Marone, but more importantly, a gathering of some of the greatest heavyweights of the last 30 years. And in fact, virtually every world champion that we have had in the last 3 decades or more in the sport of boxing. It was a magical evening. Some of the names on hand for, well, not just one evening, but for the entire weekend were Larry Holmes, Evander Holyfield, Mike Tyson, Riddick Bowe, Vladimir and Vitaly Klitschko, Michael Moore, Tim Witherspoon, Layman Brewster, Oliver McCall, Hasim Rahman, Pinklin Thomas, Ray Mercer, Tony Tucker, Tony Tubbs, Shannon Briggs, Mike Weaver, and Michael Bent. I told you it was an amazing gathering, didn't I? It is, in fact, the only time that anyone can recollect in which that many former, plus the current heavyweight champion in terms of Vladimir Klitschko, the only time that many heavyweight champions have been under one roof at one event, probably in the history of the sport of boxing. So with that extraordinary group there were some activities that were really pretty amazing. Of course, they all came to the fight in which Shannon Briggs won, and he thinks may have put himself in line to fight Vladimir Klitschko. But they came to the fight, and they also did a session, an almost 2.5-hour session, in which all of those men I mentioned in tuxedos were inside a boxing ring, each with all of them, seated around the 4 sides of the ring. I was privileged to be the person that was moderator of the discussion they all had, and I was in a director's chair, a high director's chair, in one of the corners to kind of move the conversation along, send it in different directions, and give all these men a chance to interact with each other and talk about their past and the heavyweight championship in general. In addition to that session, which was extraordinary, I interviewed every single one of these men over a 2-day span. It was fascinating and interesting and intense because you just never would have an opportunity to do 20-some interviews of former heavyweight champions and, of course, the current champ, Vladimir Klitschko. It was an extraordinary couple of days, and one of the commonalities of every activity and every interaction that I had with these great men, and for the most part that they had with each other, was a sense of camaraderie, respect, great fellowship, and you could feel, and in fact they talked about it, that all these men understood they are part of a small and extraordinarily select fraternity. It is a group that, unless you're one of that part of that group, it's pretty hard to fathom, being a member of it. And in fact, Mike Tyson, who during the course of the weekend, I thought he made a very good point about that. He said the thing that we all have in common is every man in this ring, no matter how long they kept the world championship or who they beat to get it, the world stopped to pay attention to each of these men at some point, which I thought was a very profound and interesting statement by Tyson. Now, I mentioned that Lennox Lewis was on hand for the event, and speaking of which, you can see I have my Roots of Fight Lennox Lewis shirt on to honor the occasion. And Lennox talked about a couple of fights that weren't in our interview that weren't his best fights, because we were talking about upsets, and we did it in the roundtable session as well. We talked about heavyweight upsets. Well, two of the biggest upsets of that era, when he was fighting, and even a little bit before, were upsets of Lennox Lewis, one by Hasim Rahman and one by Oliver McCall. Now, why do I bring that up? Lennox Lewis was, as it said on my T-shirt, as you can see, undisputed heavyweight champion, and had a brilliant career that I think is puts him very high into the upper echelon of heavyweight champs, in my opinion, honestly, perhaps in the top 5 of all time. But I focus in on these fights for a variety of reasons. It shows, number one, how gracious and cerebral Lennox Lewis's approach is to looking back at being heavyweight champion. He was happy to talk about those fights. And of course, as he aptly pointed out, he avenged both those losses later. But I thought what was interesting, and the part of it that we covered, was that on any given night, any great heavyweight or even any okay heavyweight can beat another heavyweight because of the fact that it takes one punch to make a difference. And I thought the conversation was pretty extraordinary. And by the way, all of the conversations that we had, those individual interviews and that session in the ring, will be part of a documentary that's being done on the weekend. So that'll be pretty extraordinary. And as I get more details about when it's going to be released, I will let you know. But I was privileged to be the one that was able to be a part of this with these great heavyweights, and really, as I said, help guide them in their conversations. Now, I mentioned that Larry Holmes, of course, was at this event, one of the great heavyweight champions who had a long reign, both in terms of years fought and also number of defenses. And I mentioned upsets when talking about Lennox Lewis. Well, Larry Holmes was also the victim of an upset in which Michael Spinks beat him when Larry was in his mid-30s and winding down what we now know was the end of the bulk of his career, though he would return. And he lost to Michael Spinks when Spinks came up from the light heavyweight ranks as light heavyweight champion and won a decision, a contested or controversial decision against Larry Holmes. And, of course, he would fight Spinks twice. And when I was doing my interview with Larry, my one-on-one, we talked a little bit about those fights. And also, I zeroed in on the second fight, and I made the statement, he didn't have to make it, that I thought the loss in that fight that he suffered might have been one of the worst decisions in boxing history. I mean, I to this day, when I watch the fight, I can't even imagine that he didn't get that decision. And of course, Larry agreed with me on it. And, Larry is intriguing because the farther he gets from his career, from actually performing in the ring, the more years go by, I think the more tuned in he is to what happened in the ring, in his fights, and also generally what was happening in the heavyweight division. Very insightful about those years. And I think that the time removed from it has allowed him to kind of be more objective in looking at all those years. And there's so much that happened with Larry Holmes that it's fascinating to hear him ruminate about it. I've been around Larry at many, many events, including charity events and ones like the one that I'm talking about on this Quick Hits. And he has always been an interesting and gracious guy. Now, gracious is an adjective we didn't use to describe Mike Tyson back in the day, but it's one we can use now because Mike Tyson, who was at this event as well, has shown us a side of him that many people did not know existed. And maybe it didn't exist before. But whatever was the case in the past, it exists now. And so Mike Tyson has kind of reinvented himself. And I can speak to that because during the course of his career, and many of you may remember, I wrote about some of this in my book. There were a few testy moments with Mike in which he was, not the easiest person for the media to deal with. But interestingly, now it's a different version of Mike Tyson. And there was a portion of Mike was sitting right next to me when we did the session in the ring in which everybody was going back and forth, and we had people talking about different things. And at one point, things got a little testy between a couple of the other heavyweight champions in the ring. And Mike was kind of like trying to mollify the situation. And I couldn't resist. I said, gentlemen, here we are. We know things had to get off the rail a little bit because Mike Tyson is the peacemaker. What does that tell us about what has happened and about him? Everybody laughed about that at that moment. But it is intriguing because he was even leaning over to me and making some off-the-cuff remarks as the evening was going on, as that session went on. And a very different Mike Tyson, certainly now, than we saw back in the day. But and at this particular event, he was very, very much a major part of the sense of camaraderie and unison that I think a lot of these men felt for each other. Finally, Evander Holyfield also was on hand. And one of the interesting things about Evander is that all through this event, who do you think would be the one person that he would spend the most time with, would kid around the most with, have things in common with? It was Riddick Bowe. And really not what you would think, given the fact that they fought a trilogy of fights that were, rough and tumble, filled with all kinds of strange eccentricities at the event and leading up to those events. And yet with all that, Holyfield and Bowe had this remarkable bond during this weekend. And to me, it was actually one of the big stories I took away from the weekend, because I thought to myself, this really embodies what I'm feeling here, because here are these three men who had these pitched battles, and yet here they are able to shed that, whatever went on with that, and have this great weekend. One other thing that was dealt with during the course of the weekend, and that I asked each of the fighters, was about the current state of the heavyweight division in terms of United States heavyweights. And as I asked each of the former champions about it, one theme emerged during the course of all this, and that was them explaining that they think part of the reason Americans have had a more difficult time in the last decade or so, or more even, is, and though we do have an American with a portion of the heavyweight championship in Deontay Wilder, but still hasn't been the best time for U.S. heavyweights. They all felt, almost to a man, that part of the problem, a big part of the problem, is that the people that are starting these heavyweights out, especially in the amateur ranks, while many of the coaches are well-intentioned and, in fact, do a wonderful job of helping these young men with all the other out-of-the-ring things that amateur boxing is supposed to help them with, and often righting their lives, while that kind of thing is being done expertly, many of the people that are doing the coaching are not necessarily great boxing coaches. Some are, but a lot are not. And so part of the issue is that, these former champions feel like maybe some of these young men are not getting as astute instruction as they did when they were youngsters coming up with, as amateurs. And I think the other point they made was that some of the great masters that were great trainers in both the amateur and the professional ranks, didn't really pass on all their tricks of the trade in many cases to someone who then passed it down to somebody else. And they feel that that's been part of the issue with the American heavyweights. All agreed, however, that it doesn't mean that that situation is permanent. And as mentioned, one American has cracked through to a heavyweight championship, at least a portion of it, in Deontay Wilder. This weekend, with all these great fighters, was beyond extraordinary. It was, in fact, one of the best 2 or 3 days I've had in my 35 years of being a boxing broadcaster. And during it, had I had a chance for some costume changes then and now during our Quick Hits video, I could have just continually worn different Roots of Fight T-shirts and sweatshirts because, of course, the folks at Roots of Fight have so many of the great heavyweight champions represented on their fight product. But for this one, we'll settle for Lennox Lewis. But in the future, I will be modeling more of my Roots of Fight shirts. So in closing, I just want to say that the feeling I got from all these great champions and how they viewed a reunion that is really history-making was that there is a great respect among these athletes, that whatever issues were there before have fallen off like leaves fall off a tree. And at the end of the day, the roots of their relationship are firmly implanted in the ground. We'll see you again on the next Quick Hits.